Let's go beyond the connection. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. Today we have on a very special guest, Rob Huffstedtler. And Rob, you are the current global head of pre-sale operations at Sitecore. You just formerly were the global head of solutions architecture. And that's a really interesting combination. I'm going to have you talk a little bit about in your background here, but it gives you a really good view onto the industry and the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is the pros and cons, C-suite's involvement on data and network architecture and what we're doing and why that's important. But before we do that, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background because you made a promise to me before we got started that you're going to share a few tips, but not on network architecture, on your award-winning chili cook-off championships that you've had. So you're a great cook, you're a dog owner, and interesting enough, it aligns with my background. You were a music major and actually started out in the music industry for a little while. I always like to know a little bit more about the folks that we're talking with here. But if you wouldn't mind just taking off on that and explain a little bit more about your background before we get started.
Sure thing. Grew up in a small town, Western North Carolina, went to school in Nashville, Belmont University. I would say go Rebels, but they changed the mascot, so I don't even know what they are anymore. Went there specifically to major in studio engineering. So it was actually music business, not music. Transitioned that into more of the artist management, publicity type stuff. But this was at that time when the whole industry was shifting towards Napster and record labels were starting to see the pressure there. So I made the decision this really wasn't where I wanted to go from a career standpoint. Ended up in about a 25-year career in professional services and IT. That was what we all called it at the time. The web was just beginning to start up. So there was a lot of Unix system admin, a lot of network admin in my early career. Content management became a thing when we learned that people didn't want to have to hand code every website. And that's basically what I've built my career on ever since in professional services. And then now moving over to the vendor side to do partner management, then moved into helping the revenue side of things, which is now I connect a lot of the dots on the revenue side of things so that we can have a clear view of what's going on and make the day-to-day work of the folks who are selling a lot easier, which I guess is also time for the obligatory safe harbor statement. All of my opinions are my own. They may or may not reflect my employer's point of view. Yes, chili. For whatever reason, I find myself compelled to enter any small town chili cook-off I can find, whether it's on the church circuit or the local pub or whatever, and pretty routinely placed second or third. I've not taken one yet, but my two big tips, three big tips actually. The first one is super important. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about later. Know your audience to the degree that you can make some guesses about whether they're bean people or no bean people, high spice, low spice. You got to have to adapt the recipe and come in with what you think is going to work there. Second one, if you're using ground meat, grind your own meat. It's super easy to do with a food processor, and it's much a better result. And use high quality stuff like short rib seems to be the power move in a chili competition. Third one, you can use some dried chili powder, but your base really needs to be chili paste from your own set of peppers. I use a mix of guajillos, pastillos, and anchos. So try those, see if you don't improve your standing in the next one.
You might have just defined my Saturday night dinner preparations. Thank you. I want to transition now over to this idea of why it matters when we're talking about our data and our network infrastructure, resiliency, why it matters to have C-suite involvement. And I'd love to actually maybe take a step back and just why data matters as the predecessor to that question.
Obviously, it matters, but there's this temptation that people, practitioners in any art, have of making their task the most important thing. So, having said that data matters, now I'm going to turn around and say data doesn't really matter. Every bit of data we have is an enabler of making a decision and delivering something to ultimately a customer who values it in some way. And a lot of data management has gone off the rails on trying to be very curious about how the data is organized and all that without thinking about how is this data going to be used in a process that drives that. The only way you get there is through that C-suite involvement. Operations has to be able to say, we need these decisions or this data to make these decisions and so on. If that doesn't happen at the C-suite level, and if the C-suite doesn't align with each other, you have all these little data silos that crop up in the organization. And then you run the risk that the presentation of data becomes the means of making a case for a decision you want to make rather than being common language that can be used by everybody to make the decisions that we've agreed are important together.
What's interesting about that, kind of what I'm taking away from that too, so you use the word silo, and data lives all over the place, which is why we look really heavily at like edge computing, and we're in multi-distributed locations throughout the country, the world sometimes. And so access to that data is a big deal. But siloed data means we spend a lot of time compiling data, just the back end of the data and getting it together versus using it proactively. And that's what I think the infrastructure, the data, the trends of the future, the wireless first kind of world that we're getting into here, it's all about making sure that we have organized, structured data at our fingertips when we need it. What are some of the challenges that you've seen with C Suite? And you work with a lot of organizations outside of just Sitecore. What are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to the C suite in putting together a network infrastructure and data organization like you just described?
I think it goes back to your first question in some ways, like the feeling that some of this is way too in the weeds. And why would I care about this? I want to do my function, whether it's accounting, marketing, production, whatever it might be. So I think that it's not to start with asking the question again of what are we trying to do here? And silos are not necessarily bad. If a set of data is only needed by a group, fine. Let's determine the right level at which we need to aggregate this stuff, manage it, and then from that, export it to a data lake that everybody can use. Or do we take an aggregate? Maybe we only need the weekly averages of something, and that becomes a data point in the data warehouse rather than having every individual record.
If the C suite doesn't grasp the importance of data and the network and the connectivity, then what are the downsides? What happens as a result?
Then you end up with very disaggregated data. You're back to everyone making their own decisions, sub optimization at the local maxima in different departments. And this is one of the worst things that can happen in any organization is where everybody's KPIs as a group or as individual groups, everyone's hitting their KPIs, but the company as a whole isn't delivering the outcomes that it's supposed to. And the argument turns into it's not my fault because I'm hitting my KPIs. Whereas what you want is how is everything we do in every process in this company or organization, if you're a nonprofit, how is it delivering the outcome that we sell to our customer because they value that outcome?
So here's an interesting take on all of this because you're now in a big way in the sales enablement and revenue function inside of the company, and you're selling solutions in this space all the time. When you're selling in, if the company that you are selling into doesn't have that kind of C suite visibility and vision, how much more difficult is that sell because there's not that overarching understanding of the importance to the company itself?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it leads to if you're selling into an organization, if you're outside, you're selling in, and you would like every company that you sell to have reached that point of enlightenment, but they don't. So a number of companies haven't reached that state of enlightenment. So you have to find yourself in those moments really thinking about which stakeholders have the most influence would be that your particular solution is relevant for and cater to their needs, which is good in the short term, but you'll have the most success in any sales operation or sales pursuit if you can help the company begin to build those connections internally. As a selling professional, what you want to be able to show is that when somebody purchases from you, it's going to drive the results of the overall business. You're talking to a business that is very disaggregated. It may be a lengthy process of finding out who the key stakeholders are who are going to influence this decision. and being able to show all of them that they're going to get a win out of it. Going back to the data thing, the only way you're going to be able to show that is if they can give you some of the data necessary to build a value.
So if you were to look at it through this lens, if you had an opportunity here in the podcast to say to all those organizations that need an updated, not a legacy system, an updated system that's going to take them into the future, right? The idea of digital transformation, and like Deloitte talks about it, as the difference between the business of today and tomorrow, which is why C-suite involvement really important, right? What would you have as a recommendation for these organizations in terms of their own internal advocacy for what they're doing? Because in a lot of ways, the technology units can be looked upon as a support function inside of the organization, where you and I both know it's absolutely one of the most critical drivers for delivering overall success, not only revenue success, but from the customer experience side, enablement internally, the decision making, the coordination between departments, right? So, what is your, if you could say to that audience, what would your recommendation be for how they could advocate for themselves internally?
So what I hear here is an invitation to get up on my soapbox. Now, I very definitely have a strong opinion about this that I work in almost every conversation of my life, which is learn the language of the people you're talking to. Whether you're a marketer looking to use data to tell your story so you can accomplish your marketing objectives, whether you're a data management, data scientist type person, everybody has a tendency to default to their own sort of parochial lingo of why this matters. In the marketing world, it's going to be L's, SQLs, yada, yada. In the data management side of the world, it's going to be how many terabytes of data we have and what our velocity of getting data in and out is and all of that. When you're talking to a CFO, he doesn't care. Or what they care about is essentially four things. Are we going to grow revenue? Are we going to cut cost? Are we going to improve the efficiency of our assets? And how are we going to reduce risk? I mean, you can throw compliance out as a fifth one, but that kind of tucks under risk. But at the end of the day, you have to show that if you want the business to invest in what you're going to do, whether it's headcount, whether it's contractors, you have to be able to say, if you put this money here, here's how we're going to be able to tell a wonderful story to our shareholders of how we created value for the business. And I see a lot of functional leadership in a variety of companies who feel it's other functions' responsibility to learn their language. You could debate that all day long. The reality is it's not going to happen. So you better learn their language. And the one language that's common across every function is accounting.
If we think about it in this kind of a way, we all know there's not an organization alive that wouldn't say, we're not customer focused. No, we're not customer obsessed. We're all customer focused. We're all customer obsessed. They're the highest voice of authority in the business. Those are your external customers, but you've got internal customers. And as much as we think about, this is what I'm taking away from what you said there, we have to understand innately our external customers in order to serve them and their challenges, their language, how they think about things. What you're saying is we need to do that internally. Our customers internally that are the decision makers that we have to influence for them to make the decisions that allow us to do what we know we want to do and can do. We've got to understand them the same kind of a way.
Yeah, I don't love the internal customer language. We've been saying that for 30 or 40 years. The risk of it is it corrupts our understanding that your function is 100% internal. It has to drive value for the external customer. Other thing I don't like about it is our external customers have a lot more choice than internal customers do. They could choose to buy from a different vendor. If you're the IT shop internally, officially your people can't buy from a different vendor, but look at the rise of SaaS as an industry and how much of that was driven by it's very difficult to get things done working IT, but I can swipe my credit card and for $200 a month, I can solve my problem.
But your point, though, I think is well taken, which is just we have to understand what's important to them. We have to understand how they're making their decisions. And a lot of times what that means is we have to think as business people instead of technologists. And that's a big transition. I'd love to get your opinion on this because we were just introduced the concept just a few minutes ago about how we can feel like a support department inside of the organization. In fact, a lot of even C-suite CIOs, CISOs, chief technology officers don't feel like they have their rightful seat at the table in the executive team because their role is to keep things up and running. And we're going to take care of all the rest. It's a very simplified view of it. But what's your point of view on the role of technology inside of these organizations?
You're reminding me of a conversation I had 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, when I was very early in my career and I was working as I think at the time I was a project manager inside a teleradiology company. And one of my responsibilities was our PACS system, which I think is picture archiving communicating system, basically content management for medical images. But one of my good buddies was the pure infrastructure and networking guy. He had anything that went through a switch, whether it was telecom or data, it was his thing. I remember telling her, I was like, Johnny, you've got the worst job on earth because nobody even remembers that we have a phone system except when it's not working. And I think a lot of us have allowed that more on the infrastructure side, especially, but the data management guys is the same way. If people only notice your function when it's perceived as not delivering, that's going to be a huge barrier to getting investment, to advancing your career, and so on. I think we've got to start treating availability as table stakes. And observability, I think we might talk about that a little bit later. We shouldn't even have to discuss those because we should be doing those so well that they're not top of mind. From that, how am I going to connect what the company as a whole is trying to do? Can I be a meaningful participant in conversations about how we as a company are going to deliver on the corporate mission, value to customer, et cetera? If our interface to people is to be an order taker and wait for them to guess what we might be able to do to support them, you're not going to be perceived as a value adder. Like at that point, you might as well just be some third party servicing company that's nothing but an expense.
There's a lot of departments within an organization that feel like I'm just a big cost center. And that's the way that I'm viewed here. And I think you're helping to unravel that today. And I want to get to what you were just talking about too. So let's do that now. The idea, the difference between availability and observability. Tell us what you're thinking there.
I think more and more this is becoming my thought that this is like the first thing you have to do as a manager, chronologically, in terms of you've just moved into a new position. Now, some of that is I've changed positions a fair amount over the last, I don't know, 7, 8 years. Whether you're working with hardware or people or money or whatever it is, you can't make a decision of any quality without knowing what's going on. And in the absence of good telemetry, of your systems or your people giving you this constant feed of information about their state, what you're left with is management by anecdote, where the most recent, most salient thing grabs everybody's attention, and we make a decision based on that and divert all resources to solving what is perceived as being a huge problem that may have been just a blip that is within the normal expected amount of variance. Most people don't even have an idea what the expected amount of variance within their systems and processes is.
What's our takeaway from that? What should we be learning from what you just said?
I think our takeaway should be, if I was to give it as a homework assignment for anybody who's listening, take an hour tonight, get a legal pad, get out your pen, think about the last 3 or 4 decisions you made, and really look at how you got to the point of making that decision. What were the facts, whether they were facts or not, on the ground that made you say, I need to make a decision about this? And what were the points of data that you used to decide what your options were? And see how many of those actually are driven by any sort of data versus anecdote.
Makes good sense. Makes good sense. I'm going to ask you now to be a visionary, a futurist, because in this world of data and infrastructure and accessibility across large multi location companies and where our customers are in remote and urban areas, there is a big trend that is well documented, written about, the wireless first trend in network infrastructure. I just wanted to get your opinion on A, what you think of the wireless first. We're already there, right? We're already connecting to every wireless connection we can and satellite connections and different things like that. But when we say a wireless first future connected to network infrastructure, what does that mean to you? And where is that going?
I think the advantages of it, the mobile revolution has been a huge part of this. There were use cases that you can't do in a hardwired environment because you need the mobility of some resources and you have things where you would want to gather data, either sensors or actuators, either want to gather the data or you want to do something in the real world that aren't in convenient places to run. There's a cost savings, obviously, if you've got regular desktops, but you take everything out and you're just doing wireless now, you need to rerun things. You're not having to run stuff with Plenum anymore. And that's awesome, but it doesn't really let you do anything you couldn't do before. Whereas being able to have mobile sensors that, are out in the field or along a pipeline or whatnot, that gives you visibility, observability again into other systems in the world that we never would have had.
One of the final questions here could be that in a wireless first world, there's also not an option these days to wait for the next mile of fiber to be laid. We're constantly, especially with the trends that are going on in the industry, like with dispersed workforces and dispersed client bases and things, it's not an option anymore. And so I just love to ask a question about, is wireless first? Is it an option? Is it just a trend? Or is this actually the direction of network infrastructure in the future?
Yeah, I would think that wireless first, I would definitely invert it from where we were 20 years ago. Like wireless was still beginning to penetrate. There were concerns about security, there were concerns about bandwidth, all of that. All of those have more or less been solved, except for absolute extreme high throughput use cases. Whereas the time to get something stood up, think about setting up networking in a natural disaster environment. One of my weird little jobs along the way, I worked for what's called a security company that does a lot more than just guards at doors. They also were involved in things like securing embassies and things of that nature. But they did some natural disaster support stuff too. Why wouldn't you go wireless first? Start with what's going to work and push it to the limits. I would question what the use cases are outside of high performance computing in a data center where wireless networking is no longer the constraint on performance.
I love that because there's still lingering perceptions that wireless isn't as stable, even in the world where there's so much redundancy now on the networks and so many ISP connections and failovers, and there's still a hesitancy there. And so I think you've given us an opportunity here to think, no, I actually have to go forward. This isn't something that I should still be considering. The whole world is already headed this way. But I have one last question for you because we've talked about a lot here, from chili cook-offs all the way to wireless first. If there was one thing that you wanted the audience to take away from our conversation today, what would that be?
Make all your decisions based on data, or at least every decision you can.
I love it. I have people who go on for 5 minutes and give me about 10 things. That was great. I love it.
You asked for one.
I did. I did. Most people don't listen to that question. Here's what I know is going to happen. We're going to have people to have questions, and I would love to provide a link to your LinkedIn profile for people to reach out and ask questions if that's okay.
Yeah, that's the best way to get me. It's also where I post my thinking pieces. I've got a blog, but it's linked to from LinkedIn. LinkedIn's really my starting point.
Fantastic. The mission here of this podcast is to bring different perspectives in and what's important, what we need to consider, how we can advocate for ourselves, how we can accomplish internally what we know we need to do. And we know we're more than a support function. We know we are the wave of success for the business. And so thanks for helping to create not a dotted line, but a direct line on that today. I really appreciate it.
Happy to do it.